Mr. President?
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, just over 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States. It's hard to believe that 3 decades have passed since he stood in front of this Capitol just yards away and announced to this nation and the world that America's moment had not passed. And it's hard to think that we have been without him now for over 6 years. I think of him and his wonderful, lovely wife, Nancy, quite often. I knew them both very well, and I know Nancy very well to this day. And she's a terrific human being, as was he. One of my first campaign trips for Ronald Reagan was with Nancy. And I can tell you there never was a stronger advocate for a presidential husband, or as a husband, period. As a man, he had the rare combination of good humor and a commitment to principle. As a leader of his party and as president, he reminded us of the need for constant recommitment to our constitutional ideals. And as a couple, Ron and Nancy were a pair for the ages. If there was any doubt, my colleagues have confirmed today in their tributes to President Reagan on the centennial of his birth that Ronald Reagan might have passed on, but he is most certainly not forgotten, not by a long shot. When Reagan was president, he inspired great reactions from both parties. I can attest, particularly with respect to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that not all of those reactions were positive. Yet today's bipartisan celebration of President Reagan's legacy shows that he has become as much a part of the American story as his greatest predecessors in office. Like other great men before him, Ronald Reagan seemed to embody the times during which he lived. The man himself, his personal story, in many ways personified America's 20th century. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in the Midwest and became a Westerner moving to California like so many other of his fellow Americans. The country that he grew up in looked very different from our own today. As Michael Barone recently reminded us in an article in the Claremont Review of Books, when America entered the Second World War, 1/4 of Americans still lived on farms, and half of those were either without electricity or only recently acquired electricity. America's population was at the same time both more diffuse and more concentrated than it is today. America's non-rural population was clustered in a few great cities. Again, as Barone explained, at the outbreak of the Second World War, 2% of all Americans lived in Brooklyn, New York. America in the 20th century became a less rural, less agricultural nation. Yet instead of concentrating in existing urban centers, new communities grew and suburbs expanded. That was the story of Ronald Reagan, who was born in tiny Tampico, Illinois, population 772 as of the 2000 census, and came to the world's attention in California, home of suburban life and the American highway. He became a Californian through and through. He loved his ranch, and he loved being on the back of a horse. The large landscapes of California and of the entire West suggest the boundless opportunity that is afforded those who work hard in this country. It was there that Ronald Reagan found his professional and political success. It was where he met Nancy and raised his family, and it is where he was finally laid to rest. But Ronald Reagan did not have it easy. As he put it, he did not grow up on the wrong side of the tracks, but he could hear the train. He lived through the Great Depression, and like countless Americans before and after him, with dogged determination and a good deal of pluck, he succeeded. At a time when college was a luxury, Ronald Reagan graduated from Eureka College. He went on to have a successful career in radio and as a sportscaster, but that was not enough. So he moved to Hollywood, where he became an actor. Of all the roles that Ronald Reagan would play, we eventually identified him most closely with the character of George Gipp in Newt Rockne, All-American. It should come as a little surprise that we would associate a good Irishman like Ronald Reagan with a movie about Notre Dame and the Fighting Irish. When George Gipp first appeared on the screen, Newt Rockne, the head coach of the Irish, was at his wits' end with his team. Seeing Gipp, who was not a member of the team, laying around, Rockne asked him if he could go in and run the ball against the varsity. Reagan's Gipp responded with an Irish twinkle in his eye, "How far?" Naturally, he ran down the field, scored a touchdown, and took his place in Notre Dame lore. For Ronald Reagan, like George Gipp, there is no challenge too big. It is a good thing that he thought that way because he faced plenty of obstacles. With the outbreak of World War II, his promising acting career was put on hold. Yet he would go on to serve as president of the Screen Actors Guild, and later he worked in television as the host of General Electric Theater. It was that association with General Electric that would set Reagan on his path towards the presidency. Going on what he called the mashed potato circuit, he spoke across the country to the thousands of GE employees, giving what would later be called the speech. Giving these after-dinner remarks, Reagan honed his thoughts about freedom, the size of government, and the Soviet menace. In 1964, on the eve of a presidential election, he would deliver that speech to the nation. Senator Barry Goldwater went on to lose that election in an epic landslide. Today, we know that conservatives might have lost that battle, but they would ultimately win the war. A week before the election, Ronald Reagan delivered a taped address, A Time for Choosing, on Goldwater's behalf. He spoke as a partisan for liberty, and he urged his fellow Americans to join him in that struggle. He concluded his remarks telling a national television audience, "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth." This speech resonated with the American people. It raised $8 million for Goldwater, an astronomical sum at the time. More importantly, it made Ronald Reagan a formidable presence on the political scene. And I knew Barry Goldwater. I knew him well. When I ran for the Senate, he was one of two people I came to visit here in Washington to just get some advice from. I admired him so much, and it was a privilege to serve with him. The other one was Chuck Grassley, who was then in the House, and I count him as one of my dearest friends on earth. Reagan and Grassley, two great people. Goldwater and Grassley, two great people. Against the odds and conventional wisdom, Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California in 1966. Now, to the mistake of the California establishment, they underestimated the actor from the Midwest, and he went on to beat his more liberal primary opponent and the popular incumbent governor. Underestimating Reagan was a mistake that the Washington establishment would make time and time again when he arrived here 14 years later. They never seemed to understand what was so obvious to President Reagan. For all of the superficial differences, Americans of his age were not so different than the generation that founded this nation, fought the Civil War, worked through the Great Depression, and struggled for civil rights. In the end, Americans of today are committed to the same principles of liberty and equality that animated the authors of our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. This shared commitment to our founding principles served him well, because he took office at the time of great uncertainty, a time not unlike our own. A combination of factors seemed to be putting the aspirations of Americans out of reach. To be blunt, America was at its heels. The prime interest rate was 15%. Inflation was 12.5%. And civilian unemployment was at 7%. When he ran in '76, Ronald Reagan, when he ran, I was the first person he ever pre-primary endorsed. At least that was what I was told. And I have cherished that memory for all these years. But at that time, government regulations and tax rates were smothering American innovation, and with it, the American dream. And abroad, the picture was just as grim. An imperialist Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and was supporting revolutionary movements across the globe. The The American hostages had not yet been freed from Iran. Yet when Ronald Reagan left office 8 years later, he had left his mark. According to his biographer, Lou Cannon, when he came into office, there were 4,414 individual tax returns with an adjusted gross income of more than $1 million. By 1987, fueled by tax cuts, the breaking of inflation, and explosive economic growth, there were 34,944 such returns. When he entered the White House, only 1 in 6 Americans owned a microwave, and VCRs were a luxury for the wealthy. By the time he left office, these were common household goods. He helped to restore our understanding of a limited judiciary that respects the traditions of the American people and their elected representatives, and he restored faith in our men and women in uniform. Just before he left office, President Reagan reviewed the troops at Andrews Air Force Base one last time. During that visit, he said that serving as Commander-in-Chief was the most sacred, most important task of the presidency. Barely 5 years after America left South Vietnam, Reagan spoke at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention and reminded America that Vietnam had been a noble cause. The rush to blame America first in our conflict with totalitarian regimes and the days of holding our military men and women in low esteem came to an end with the Reagan presidency. And though his greatest achievement, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, would occur on his successor's watch, the writing was on the wall by the time Ronald Reagan left office. And his successor deserves credit as well. His recommitment to freedom during our twilight struggle with what was truly an evil empire quite literally saved the world and liberated millions and millions of people. It is no surprise that he will be honored in Prague, Budapest, and Krakow, the home of his great partner, Pope John Paul II, later this summer for his role in exposing the great lie that was the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan succeeded as president because he knew what he was about. In his farewell address from the Oval Office, he said, "I went into politics in part to put up my hand and say, stop. I was a citizen politician, and it seemed the right thing for a citizen to do." I think we have stopped a lot of what needed stopping, and I hope we have once again reminded the people that man is not free unless government is limited. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as the law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts. I could not agree more. And that Reagan revolution, the aspiration of citizens for greater freedom and greater futures for the generations that follow, continues. I'm proud to have been part of that revolution. President Reagan took a flyer on me when I first ran for the Senate, supporting me in my primary. I have tried to do him proud. I remember well the blistering hot day in the Rose Garden when he signed the Hatch-Waxman legislation into law back in 1984. In his signing statement, he joked that with this law, everyone wins, particularly our elderly Americans. Senior citizens require more medication than any other segment of our society. I speak with some authority on that. That's what he said. In my opinion, that law typified the commitments of President Reagan. Since its passage, it has saved the federal government and consumers hundreds of billions of dollars. Some say trillions now. And it essentially created the generic drug industry and incentives for the creation of the next generation of saving drugs. I worked with him when he was in office, and as I work today for the citizens of Utah, his principled example is always on my mind. We still have work to do. Reagan understood the danger of what is today called progressivism, what was then called liberalism. It knows no bounds. As he put it, no government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. Government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. In some respects, Ronald Reagan belonged to a different age. He was governor during the student protests of the 1960s. He entered the national political consciousness during a presidential campaign where the possibility of global nuclear conflict was an imminent threat. When he became president, he was only a few years removed from the widespread urban riots and the end of the Vietnam War. When he spoke at Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he spoke to the men who actually scaled those cliffs and liberated a continent. Today, most of those veterans have passed on, but ultimately, Reagan remains one of us. I think that his advisor, David Gergen, got it wrong when he mused that Reagan's legacy was how much he changed our minds. In my view, Ronald Reagan was a success because he understood that the American people did not need to change their minds. Americans in 1980 had the same beliefs and hopes that we have always had. Ronald Reagan's genius was in giving voice to those hopes. Ronald Reagan was a big man, made for a big screen and eventually the biggest stage, and he played his part well. To borrow from Hollywood, he knew that even as time goes by, the fundamental things apply before leaving office. President Reagan addressed the nation one last time. Speaking to the citizens of this shining city upon a hill, he told us, we did it. We weren't just marking time, we made a difference. We made the city stronger. We made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. Indeed. It has been said that Ronald Reagan had a love affair with the American people. He did. But it took two to tango. Ronald Reagan loved his country, but I think his country loved him even more. And that includes people on both sides of this floor at the time. Mr. President, I yield the floor.